lawyer. Does this new revelation create any legal problems for the Trump team? Waiting game. Vice President Pence says President Trump will sign the Russian sanctions legislation into law soon. Vladimir Putin already is retaliating. Expelled U.S. diplomats are packing up to leave Russia right now. Why has the president waited 5 days to act, and how much longer will he delay? And military options. Senator Lindsey Graham says President Trump has told him there will be war with North Korea if it continues developing missiles and nuclear weapons to hit the United States. So why is the Secretary of State telling North Koreans, quote, "We are not your enemy"? I'm Wolf Blitzer. You're in the Situation Room.
This is CNN Breaking News.
We're following breaking news and a huge reversal from the Trump team after weeks of denying the president was involved in the misleading initial statement about his son's meeting with a Russian attorney during the presidential campaign. Today, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders told reporters the president, quote, "weighed in as any father would," close quote. That undercuts repeated denials from the president's personal attorney and raises serious questions about whether members of the Trump team and even potentially the president himself could be in some sort of legal jeopardy. The top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Mark Warner, is complaining that even though the administration keeps saying there is nothing to the Russia story, they don't act that way at all. Senator Warner tells CNN it seems a bit strange, he says, that the President of the United States helped draft a statement that, quote, intentionally deceived the American people. We're following all of the conflicting signals also coming out of North Korea right now. Senator Lindsey Graham says President Trump told him war with North Korea may be inevitable. Graham also says the president told him if thousands are going to die, it will be, quote, over there. But just this afternoon, during an extremely rare news conference, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the U.S. does not want regime change and told the North Koreans, quote, "we are not your enemy." We're covering all of that, much more this hour with our guests, including Senator Chris Murphy, a key Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee. And our correspondents and specialists are also standing by. Let's start with our senior White House correspondent, Jeff Zeleny. Jeff, tell us more about this afternoon's big flip-flop about the president's involvement in his son's initial statement on that controversial Russia meeting at Trump Tower in New York last year.
Good evening, Wolf. We have heard repeatedly from the president's lawyer that the president, in fact, was not involved in shaping that initial statement. In fact, he did not know about the meeting until the New York Times was on the verge of reporting it. But today we are learning something entirely different. At the White House press briefing earlier this afternoon, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said the president weighed in. She said, like any father would. New questions tonight for the White House over President Trump's hands-on role crafting an explanation of his son's Russia meeting during the heat of the 2016 election.
The president weighed in as any father would based on the limited information that he had.
The White House acknowledging for the first time the president helped write a statement about a meeting that his son, Donald Trump Jr., son-in-law Jared Kushner, and campaign chairman Paul Manafort had with a Russian lawyer and 4 others in Trump Tower. Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders responding to a Washington Post report that said the president dictated that misleading statement.
He certainly didn't dictate, but, you know, he, like I said, he weighed in, offered suggestion like any father would do.
But those words directly contradict the president's own lawyer, who insisted Mr. Trump didn't help write the statement, saying the meeting was about Russian adoption, with no mention of accepting dirt on Hillary Clinton's campaign.
I wasn't involved in the statement drafting at all, nor was the president. I'm assuming that was between Mr. Donald Trump Jr., between Don Jr., and his lawyer. I'm sure his lawyer was involved. That's how you do it.
Attorney Jay Sekulow, who's representing the president in the Russia investigation, said it again and again last month on television. The president had no role.
But I do want to be clear that the president was not involved in the drafting of the statement and did not issue the statement. It came from Donald Trump Jr.
The statement was drafted aboard Air Force One on July 8th, as the president flew back to Washington from the G20 summit in Hamburg, Germany. Initially, the meeting was described like this in a statement to the New York Times. We primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children that was active and popular, but it was not a campaign issue at the time, and there was no follow-up. Yet only days later, the real purpose of the meeting became clear when Donald Trump Jr. released emails showing it was part of Russia and its government support for Mr. Trump. from officials trying to take down the Clinton campaign. The president's son replied, "If it's what you say, I love it." Tonight, it's the latest case of conflicting signals as the White House tries to move beyond the cloud of the Russia investigation. But the questions put the new White House press secretary back on defense.
The statement that was issued was true and there were no inaccuracies in the statement. I think what the bigger question is, everybody wants to try to make this some story about misleading. The only thing I see misleading is a year's worth of stories that have been fueling a false narrative about this Russia collusion and based on a phony scandal based on anonymous sources. And I think that is, if we're going to talk about misleading, that's the only thing misleading I see in this entire process.
Leading Republicans see it differently on Capitol Hill, where 2 investigations are underway into potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia.
I don't know what role the president played, if any. Here's what I would suggest, that when you put out a misleading statement, it's going to be hard to convince people to stop looking at other things.
And that comment there from Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, echoes concern from other Republicans, Wolf, because it goes to the credibility of the White House. Now, all of this happened on Air Force One on July 8th, flying back from Hamburg, Germany. I was one of the reporters on that flight, Wolf, and it was about an 8.5-hour flight or so. And I am told by people on the flight that for a good share of it, the president's daughter, son-in-law, and a couple top aides were huddled with him in his office aboard Air Force One, crafting this statement. It went out, and then the plane landed back at Andrews Air Force Base about 8:30 or so, Wolf. 4 hours earlier, the New York Times story had already come out. And of course, in the coming days, we learned more and more about that meeting. So indeed, that happened after the G20 summit as they were flying home here to Washington.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. Jeff Zeleny doing excellent reporting for us, as he always does. Let's get some reaction up on Capitol Hill. CNN's Ryan Nobles is standing by. Ryan, a top Democrat says the president's son and other top members of the Trump team have to tell their stories in person. Update our viewers.
Yeah, that's right, Wolf. We talked one-on-one with Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. He's important in this process because he is the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And he told me that if the president played any role in crafting a statement that turned out to be purposely misleading, it is a serious problem.
This administration continues to say, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, there's nothing there. Yet they don't act that way at all. And what we have here is where earlier statements have said the president was not involved at all. Now it appears he actually drafted the language in a way that intentionally deceived the American people, because we clearly found that the facts were not as the president laid out, that this was a meeting that was about Russian efforts to try to influence the campaign and try to provide information about Hillary Clinton.
And from Warner's perspective, this steps up the need for the Senate Intelligence Committee to hold interviews with not only Donald Trump Jr., but with Paul Manafort and with Jared Kushner, who is yet to speak to senators specifically. Listen to what he told me about that.
We've got a lot more questions for people like Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. that we're going to want senators involved in the questioning, not just staff. So more to come.
So you expect then Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, Jared Kushner, all 3 of them, do you expect them in front of your committee?
I don't see any way that some of the principals, and there are a series of other individuals who've been affiliated with efforts involving the Russians, they're all going to have to come and appear in person before the senators.
Now, Senator Warner did not say whether or not those appearances would be in public or behind closed doors. He said that could still be negotiated. But, Wolf, it's important to point out that I asked him specifically how Senator Richard Burr, who is the chairman of the committee and a Republican, feels about this. And he said he has made it clear to Senator Burr that if these interviews don't happen, this won't be something that the entire committee can sign off on when the final report is issued. So he's left very little room for negotiating.
All right, Ryan, thanks very much. Ryan Nobles up on Capitol Hill. Our Justice correspondent Pamela Brown has also been working her stories. Pamela, the story here keeps shifting, and it's significant. What are you hearing, first of all, from your sources about how that first statement attributed to Donald Trump Jr. was crafted?
Well, we've learned, Wolf, my colleagues and I have spoken with several people familiar with the statement's crafting, and we've learned that even before the G20 summit, both Jared Kushner's team and Don Jr.'s legal team felt the strategy should be a detailed account about the Trump Tower meeting with the Russian lawyer. And then it appears the plan changed aboard Air Force One on the trip back from the G20. Now, the degree to which the president was involved, what exactly he knew at the time, and who else was involved in this initial misleading statement varies depending on who you speak with. We've been told that some of the president's closest aides, as we heard Jeff Zeleny report there, helped strategize on this response. Now, as we have previously reported, anyone involved in crafting this statement, including the president, could have legal exposure in the special counsel probe into Russia's interference in the election. So I can bet, Wolf, that Robert Mueller, who is, of course, leading that probe, is very interested in who is crafting this statement.
All right, I want you to stay with us. I want to also bring in our other specialists. And Phil Mudd, your reaction to these latest developments, because these twists and turns are dramatic.
Well, in some ways, they're not twists and turns. Let's go to the start of the administration. We have an administration that hates leaks. Let me give you two kinds of leaks, because you're going to hear a lot of confusion about this. One is a leak that reveals national security information, for example, operational information about ISIS. The second is a leak that is not national security, but is highly embarrassing. We started down this path with a leak that revealed that General Flynn had misled the vice president about his conversation with Russia. Fast forward 6 months, we have yet another leak that says that initial claim that this was about adoptions, that meeting between the Russians and Don Jr. wasn't accurate. I can see why the White House doesn't like leaks, but what they're going to tell you is that this is about national security. It's not. It's because the press is finding out dirt that indicates that there's a huge air gap between what they say and what the truth is. We're finding that out starting with Flynn and going to today.
You know, Rebecca Berg, let me play the clip. This is Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, confirming that the president was involved in that initial statement.
The statement that Don Jr. issued is true. There's no inaccuracy in the statement. The president weighed in as any father would based on the limited information that he had.
That's very different than the statements we got from the president's personal lawyer at the time. Jay Sekulow said the president didn't know anything about this and wasn't involved in drafting that statement.
And so you have two potentially troubling explanations for why Sekulow went on television and said what he said. The first could be that he wasn't telling the truth, which of course would be problematic for obvious reasons. The second possibility here is that Trump's legal team, including Sekulow, were not fully informed, were not fully engaged before he went on television to try to represent what the president had been doing. That would also be problematic. So no good answer here really for the administration. But certainly if I were Donald Trump's counsel, it's troubling for them that he would have been engaged in this process at all. I mean, it really harkens back to what we saw with the president and Jim Comey when he was speaking with Comey about the ongoing investigation, when he should have been just separating himself as much as possible from that process. We're seeing this again because this is all very personal for the president, and he's having trouble not seeing it as such.
You know, Pamela, based on everything you're hearing from your sources, how problematic potentially is this for the president?
Well, it certainly could be problematic because, as we previously reported, Robert Mueller, who's leading the special counsel probe, is looking at the obstruction of justice angle of this. And so, of course, if the president was involved in potentially crafting a misleading statement, then what Robert Mueller would want to find out is, was this part of a cover-up? Was this part of an obstruction of justice aspect of the investigation? Now, the argument legally could be made that you can't obstruct justice when you're releasing something to the press, to the media. This is not having to do with the investigation. But then on the flip side of that, the argument could be made perhaps you're trying to mislead the lead investigator, which would be Robert Mueller. So all of this could be taken into account and something that could be of interest to investigators. And to Phil's point, you know, the leaks that are coming from the White House, I think, are more of a symptom than the actual disease, because it is so much harder than it should be, Wolf, to get to the truth. Either the president was part of crafting the statement or not. And you hear the lawyer coming out a few weeks ago saying he wasn't involved at all, and now we heard from the White House that, in fact, yes, he did weigh in. What is the truth? Why is it so hard to get to the truth?
Because this is going to be potentially, Mark Preston, an issue that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, is going to have to face. Maybe he's already dealing with it even as we speak, he and his team. What are you hearing from your various sources about this late-breaking development?
Well, a couple of things. Not only Robert Mueller, but what we're seeing up on Capitol Hill, too, and they're actually being very public about it, is that when they see a misdirection by the White House or any kind of evidence that they may be trying to cover things up, they are going to try to investigate it even further. I really do think that this is damaging, not only for the president when it comes to this issue, this specific issue component of the Russia investigation, but anything going forward, because if you are Robert Mueller, if you are the investigators on the Senate Judiciary Committee or the Senate Intelligence Committee or the House Intelligence Committee, it's just going to force you to think even deeper about what else they may have tried to misdirect on. And that is a very precarious position to be in if you are President Trump, specifically when we saw him, Wolf, say just a few weeks ago, basically sent out a warning to Robert Mueller saying, you better not look into my family's finances. Again, all you're doing is baiting Robert Mueller to do that.
Everybody stand by. There's a lot more going on, including right now on the Senate floor. Senators are voting on the confirmation of Christopher Wray to become the next FBI director, succeeding James Comey, who was fired. We'll have that. We should get the result momentarily. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Aaron Burnett out front. Stories that matter.
You've got the money and you've got the passion, but how do you actually make a difference?
From the people making headlines.
Did you?
Your book, the subtitle is A Rejection of Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle. You just talked about some of the principles that you think conservatives need to get back to. Let's talk about the rejection of destructive politics, because you're quite critical in the book, and also you have been critical in real life about some of the things that President Trump has said. His mockery of a disabled reporter. I could go on, but it's only an hour-long show. What do you think political leaders need to do when he does things that are indecent?
Well, let me just say, this didn't start with President Trump.
Absolutely not.
I was in the House from 2001 to 2012, 13. During that time, we had a Republican stand up during President Obama's State of the Union and yell, "You lie," that famous episode. We've seen things like this, and I talk about it in the book, when Gabby Giffords got shot. A year later, she came back during the State of the Union. She was going to resign the next day. And I sat with her, and she couldn't stand on her own still at that time, and so I helped her up during the President's applause lines, President Obama's applause lines. I started getting texts and emails from Republicans saying, "Why are you standing? The President is speaking. Do you agree with the President?" And just this shirts versus skins attitude that really predates President Trump. But I think we've just gotten coarser and coarser. And I talk a lot about it in the book, things like the birtherism that was put forward. I think that was awful.
By President Trump, mainly. He was one of the biggest proponents of it. He was one of the sheriff in Arizona was Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
Sure. Sent investigators to Hawaii.
Yeah.
And then had a press conference after he was defeated, still saying it was a forged birth certificate. This was in December of last year. A terrible thing to do and to prolong. And I think that the rejection of destructive politics, we've got to reject that. And it, as a conservative, I mean, that's just not what conservatives should do. And I mean, we've got huge problems to solve in this country. The biggest, in my view, is our looming debt and growing deficit. We have $20 trillion in debt. We'll be over $1 trillion a year in deficits here coming up soon. And we know that the only way to solve that is for both parties to sit down and share the risk. Every decent budget agreement we've had in the past 40 years is when Republicans and Democrats, you know, Reagan and Tip O'Neill, or the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act, or budget deal of 1997, when Republicans and Democrats have said, all right, let's share the risk and do it together. And to say you're conservative and then say, I'm not even going to deal with entitlement spending, we'll put that off. We can't do that anymore. And we've got to sit down, Republicans and Democrats. You need 60 votes in the Senate to do just about anything if you're not under reconciliation. And we're going to be there soon, and we should keep that. The President is calling for us to get rid of the filibuster. That would be an awful thing. The Senate is at its best when we work together on these things.
So your being outspoken doesn't come with a potential price. President Trump has reportedly been talking with people about getting challengers, Republican challengers, to run against you. Politico's reporting the White House officials have met with at least 3 possible primary challengers against you. You're running for re-election next year. How worried are you that doubling down on your outspokenness on these issues with this book might cost you your political career?
Well, I think some things are more important than a political career. I think, yeah, it would have been probably politically smarter to wait until you're safely re-elected to write a book like this. But then it wouldn't mean as much. If you don't have anything to risk politically, it doesn't mean as much. And I felt that it was important enough to stand up and write this. And so I've done it.
And there are critics out there on your left who say, talk is cheap, writing this book is one thing, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do?
Well, like I said, I've reached across the aisle. I've worked on the so-called Gang of Eight when I first came to the Senate.
On immigration
I spent a lot of
reform.
time. Yeah, and we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to sit down together. I've partnered with Tim Kaine to do a bipartisan AUMF, authorization for use of military force. To prove that Republicans and Democrats can get along, I marooned myself on an island with Martin Heinrich, a Democrat senator from New Mexico, to rival survival to show that Republicans and Democrats can get along. If
you worked with Democrats on Cuba, too, with the Obama administration.
I have. And I have agreed with President Obama on Cuba policy. I've disagreed with this president. And one thing that I should point out, too, I came to Congress, in 2001, disagreed with President Bush on No Child Left Behind, prescription drug benefit, disagreed with him for 8 years on Cuba policy. And yet, a couple of months ago, he came to Arizona and did a fundraiser for me because we agreed on most issues and worked together on most issues. We've got to get away from this attitude that you have to agree with the president and that a senator should be a rubber stamp for everything the president wants at all times. I will agree with this president when I think he's doing conservative things and doing decent things, and I'll oppose him and speak up when I think that he isn't. And I think that's what Arizona voters expect me to do.
The book is Conscience of a Conservative by Senator Jeff Flake. Thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Don't go before you sign my copy. Thanks so much, Senator. Coming up, a big election, and now opposition leaders snatched from their homes in the dead of night, rampant violence, and more chaos in oil-rich Venezuela. We're going there live. Stay with us.
Choose to go.
So in response to that, the acting administrator of the Drug Enforcement Agency sent an email to all of his agents that reads, in part, "In writing to you, I seek to advance no political, partisan, or personal agenda, nor do I believe that a special agent or task force officer of the DEA would mistreat a defendant. I know that you would not, so why do I write? I write to offer a strong reaffirmation of the operating principles to which we as law enforcement professionals adhere. I write because we have an obligation to speak out when something is wrong. That's what law enforcers do." I'm Brooke Baldwin. Thanks for being with me. The Lead with Jake Tapper starts now.
A major admission from the White House just now. President Trump, quote, weighed in on that misleading statement from Donald Trump Jr. about his meeting with the Russians. The Lead starts right now. Amid all that, one lawmaker's searing indictment of his own party, Senator Jeff Flake speaking his mind and then some, railing against President Trump, saying his GOP colleagues are in denial. But will Flake's words lead to any real action? Senator Flake will join us live this hour. Two potentially explosive crises overseas. One, a stark warning of war, as Senator Lindsey Graham paints a terrifying picture of the dwindling options with a nuclear North Korea. Then, what in the world is Russia up to near the border of several NATO countries, and why is Putin stockpiling so much military gear there? And then, is this the ultimate fake news tale? A new lawsuit alleging the White House may have helped concoct a huge fake news story along with Fox News, exploiting crackpot conspiracy theories and smearing a young murdered DNC staffer. But can the details of this lawsuit be believed?
This is CNN Breaking News.
Welcome to The Lead, and we begin with breaking news in our money lead from Wall Street. Let's take a live look at the big board where the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed just shy of an all-time high of 22,000. The Dow, as well as the NASDAQ and S&P, has hit record highs in July despite turmoil in Washington and international tensions. excuse me, the president tweeted about the Dow this morning saying, quote, stock market could hit all-time high again. 22,000 today, was 18,000 only 6 months ago on election day. Mainstream media seldom mentions, exclamation point. And that brings us to our politics lead. In the former Soviet Republic of Georgia today, Vice President Pence promised that President Trump would sign into law very soon the tough new sanctions on Russia that Congress passed overwhelmingly and delivered to the White House last Friday.
And in a further sign of our commitment, very soon President Trump will sign legislation to strengthen and codify the United States sanctions against Russia.
Pledges like that notwithstanding, Senate Republican sources tell me that they are concerned that President Trump might not sign the sanctions into law, though their worries are assuaged given the fact that they have enough votes to override were the president to veto the measure. And even if the president does nothing at all and just lets the bill sit, it will become a law in 10 days automatically. The president's seeming ambivalence on the Russian sanctions is intriguing, coming alongside a deafening silence, as it does, from President Trump about Moscow's recent retaliation to those same sanctions. President Vladimir Putin's order that the U.S. eliminate 755 staffers from the U.S. diplomatic mission there, the most aggressive move by the Kremlin against Washington since the final years of the Cold War. In the past few days, since the move by Putin, the president has had plenty to say about the news media, about Republican senators, about Democratic senators, and more. But the president has had nothing to say publicly about Putin or that move. Nor has the president had anything public to say today about a different Russia-related story. The Washington Post scooped that President Trump, quote, personally dictated that initial misleading statement from his son Donald Trump Jr. when first asked about that June 2016 campaign meeting with the Russians. We now know that the encounter happened because an associate of Donald Trump Jr. offered to get him a meeting with a Russian government lawyer who was promising incriminating information about Hillary Clinton. But that initial statement about the meeting was misleading. It suggested that Trump Jr. and the lawyer had, quote, primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children, unquote. Now, that statement did not mention the purpose of the meeting and had to be updated after the New York Times obtained more evidence about the meeting and offered many more details. The Times had reported, of course, that President Trump personally signed off on that misleading statement, which at the time, one of the president's attorneys told me was not true. The New York Times also reporting that the president personally signed off on the original statement that Donald Trump Jr. issued on Saturday, that one that required a follow-up clarification because it didn't disclose the idea of opposition research.
Yeah, that's not true. First of all,
the president did not sign off on that statement.
The statement was issued by Donald Trump Jr. The president was on the return from his trip to the G20. Again, these are stories that are out there. People can say anything they want, but the fact is that's just not true.
Today, however, we found out from the Post that the president did more than look at Don Jr.'s misleading statement. He dictated it against the advice of his advisors, who favored a fuller disclosure about the meeting, suspecting that all the information was going to come out anyway, which it did. Now, asked for comment just a few minutes ago, the White House press secretary acknowledged what the president's lawyer denied, acknowledging that the president did play a role in the drafting of that misleading statement.
The statement that Don Jr. issued is true. There's no inaccuracy in the statement. The president weighed in as any father would based on the limited information that he had.
To be clear, of course, the statement that Don Jr. issued, that was dictated by the president, according to the Post, was misleading. It did not even remotely acknowledge the purpose of the meeting, which was Donald Trump Jr. wanting to meet someone billed as a Russian government lawyer with one specific purpose: to obtain dirt on Hillary Clinton. A meeting attended, by the way, by Jared Kushner and campaign chair Paul Manafort. Now, you as a citizen, you should expect a much higher standard of truth than the one that the White House press secretary just enunciated. If a meeting takes place so campaign officials can get dirt on a political rival from the Russian government, describing that meeting as being about adoption and not mentioning the purpose of the meeting, it's not true. It's inaccurate. It is so misleading as to be a lie. And you, as a citizen, you have every right to wonder, why would the president hide the truth and be inaccurate about this? Why would he want to hide from you the facts of this meeting, which they insist was innocent? And, as always, what does any of this have to do with making America great again? So how does the president's just weighing in, as we learned today, square with what we've been told in the past about the formulation of that initial misleading statement? CNN's Jim Acosta is looking into this evolving storyline from the White House.
Yes, the White House said the president was involved in the crafting of a misleading statement that initially obscured the true nature of his son Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with a Russian lawyer during the campaign.
There's no inaccuracy in the statement. The president weighed in as any father would based on the limited information that he had.
The questions came after a Washington Post story reporting that the president dictated the statement released July 8th for Trump Jr., then inaccurately claimed the meeting was focused on Russian adoptions. We primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children that was active and popular with American families years ago and was since ended by the Russian government. 3 days after that statement, Trump Jr. released 4 pages of his own emails showing the Russian attorney planned to provide information that, quote, would incriminate Hillary and her dealings with Russia and would be very useful to your father. Talking to reporters on Air Force One the next day, the president was still talking up the adoption explanation, saying they talked about the adoption stuff, which was actually a big thing at the time, but nothing happened. A story he was still using at a news conference the following day.
I guess they talked about, as I see it, they talked about adoption and some things. Adoption wasn't even a part of the campaign. But nothing happened from the meeting. Zero happened from the meeting. And honestly, I think the press made a very big deal over something that really a lot of people would do.
Say something. Asked about that initial misleading statement from Donald Trump Jr., White House outside counsel Jay Sekulow insisted the president was not involved.
That statement was, by the way, I wasn't involved in the statement drafting at all, nor was the president. I'm assuming that was between Mr. Donald Trump Jr., between Don Jr., and his lawyer. I'm sure his lawyer was involved. That's how you do it. And you know that. And so to put this on the president, I think is just absolutely incorrect.
Leaders from both parties say the president's involvement in his son's statement is yet another concern for the Russia investigation.
If it's true, I think it is of serious concern, but we don't know that it is.
If you'd had the emails available to you, you would understand that the whole meeting wasn't about adoption, that the email chain shows that it was about the Russian government wanting to help the Trump campaign. I don't think the statement helped Don Jr. I don't know what role the president played, if any. Here's what I would suggest, that when you put out a misleading statement, it's going to be hard to convince people to stop looking at other things.
The other big question lingering here at the White House is whether the president would sign a bill that would limit his ability to ease sanctions on Russia. Today, the White House said the president would sign that legislation. Congressional leaders were not very concerned the president would veto the bill. The measure has enough support in Congress to override any veto. And Jake, getting back to Donald Trump Jr.'s statement, for all of the talk about the new chief of staff here bringing order and discipline to the White House, there's another thing that's in short supply over here, and that's honesty. Jake?
Jim Acosta, thank you so much. Let's turn now to Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, whose new book is rattling more than a few cages today. It is titled Conscience of a Conservative, a Rejection of Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle. Senator, thanks so much for being here. I have a different Conscience of a Conservative book at home by Barry Goldwater.
Like that one.
Barry Goldwater. It looks a lot like this one. Obviously, the content very different. Congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you.
I want to get to that in a second, but first, let's start with this news. The Washington Post reporting and the White House confirming that President Trump played a role in drafting this initial misleading statement about Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with the Russians. What's your reaction?
I was surprised to hear that, but I know that the committees of jurisdiction, the Senate Intelligence Committee on a bipartisan basis is looking at this, as they should, and I'm sure Bob Mueller and others will as well. So, but it was a bit of a surprise.
Well, what about the fact that you have the president's lawyer going out there and telling people he did not play any role at all in the drafting of the statement, and now we're told that he did, and then also just the issue of the fact that the statement was misleading. It said it was just about adoptions, when obviously we know, as Lindsey Graham just said, that the purpose of the meeting was to get dirt on Hillary Clinton. Does this White House have a huge credibility gap?
Well, I would agree with Lindsey in that regard. It's tough to, tell people not to look elsewhere if they don't believe that you're giving the full story. But we'll leave it to the committees of jurisdiction. I'm glad we have a bipartisan committee looking into this, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they're committed to do it, and others are as well. So,
Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, was asked today if the credibility gap, these transparency and honesty issues, were hurting the Republican agenda. Take a listen to what she had to say.
I think what's hurting the legislative agenda is Congress's inability to get things passed.
What do you think?
Well, that's a pretty fair criticism. You know, first and foremost, it's our responsibility to pass things. I think, have reached the limit of what we can do on health care with just our party. And so we're going to be reaching across the aisle, and perhaps we should have started that way, but that's where we're going. What do you think of the new Chief of Staff, retired Marine General? I'm glad he's there. I think it's been a good start, and obviously the measures that have been taken so far, I think, will give us more confidence that we'll see a little less chaos over there, and that'll help. That'll help. Let's turn to your book. You have a comment in here which was really fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of criticism about the president and his behavior and how Republicans, conservatives specifically, have dealt with him. At one point you write, quote, "To carry on in the spring of 2017 as if what was happening was anything approaching normalcy required a determined suspension of critical faculties and tremendous powers of denial." It's a pretty strong thing to say. Yeah. What do you think Republicans, conservatives, Americans should be doing? Well, there are two parts of conservatism. The first, I would argue, is policy. We've always adhered to limited government, economic freedom, individual responsibility. Barry Goldwater in 1960 felt that the party was straying from those principles, and that's why he wrote the original Conscience of a Conservative. I think we're facing a similar crisis now, where we've kind of, as Republicans, taken up an unfamiliar banner that this populism and in some cases xenophobia, anti-immigration, protectionism. That's not familiar to us, and I don't think that is a governing philosophy. So on the policy side, I think we have an issue. But also, being conservative means, particularly in foreign policy, that you're steady and that you're measured in your use of diplomacy and force and predictable, and that we embrace our allies and recognize our enemies. And that, I think, has been lacking, and I'm concerned about that. I've heard from many Republicans on this show and also just talking in the green room who think that, in fact, the president's point of view is embracing our enemies and giving the stiff arm to our allies in a lot of ways. Well, for those of us who were raised in the Cold War and having the Soviet Union and now Russia adopting some of the same attitudes as the Soviet Union, that was the existential threat. And now to be seen as being more friendly or more trusting, and to distrust our own institutions of government, our intelligence communities, just seems foreign to us, and I think it should seem foreign to us. And I think we need, when we see that, to speak up more often. Senator, stick around. We're going to take a very quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more about your book. Stay with us.
Aaron Burnett out front. Stories that matter.
You've got the money and you've got the passion, but how do you actually make a difference?
From the people making